After e4, c5, knight f3 and knight c6, we play Rossolimo. This is the second part of the previous video. So queen c7 now, and we castle. After a6, we take the knight. So as mentioned in the previous video, we don't care about the fact that black has managed to keep the pawn structure safe, because black has wasted too many tempo moves, basically because he moved the queen too early in the game. So now we play rook e1, and the move we're going to go through now is e6 again. So now we play d4, and after pawn takes, we play c3. As you remember, if pawn takes pawn, then we develop the knight. We have a threat of knight d5, and all of the other threats there are described in the previous video. In this video though, I'm not going to go through black accepting this pawn and going up in material, but rather developing. Well, so now we have to think, what could black do? Well, e5 is not possible because we will just take it. d5 is the worst move because we're just going to win a lot of tempos, or black is going through a disaster. So for example, d5, we can play knight takes d4, we're attacking the queen, and we're also threatening to win this pawn completely for free. We'll go up in material a lot eventually, so black will have to move. Where does the queen go? Well, if the queen stays in a square where she can protect the d5 pawn, well, okay, if she doesn't, then we're just going to win material. If she does, let's say queen to d6, then we can take the pawn. And now the pawn cannot take back because it's pained by the rook. And after queen takes, we have a sacrifice, which is knight to e6. We're completely winning here. We're threatening to win the queen. So, well, the queen cannot take the knight because she gets taken. The bishop cannot take the knight because then the queen is free. The bishop will be pinned. So the best move by black now is to take our queen, but then we can play a double check. Knight g7, double check. The black player will not be able to take the rook, neither the bishop can take the knight because two pieces are checking the king, and then the king will have to move. And then we can just play rook takes, comes with a check, and then king c7, bishop f4. This is going to be a disaster. The knight will have a safe square, either h5, g3, or e8, it depends. But there's no point in continuing this game. White is up 2 pawns, better pawn structure and development as well. So let's go back. Right, here we are. So after d4 and pawn takes, we play c3. In this case, as I said, we're not going to go through pawn takes, but rather knight to f6. So this is a new move we're going to go through. The knight f6 is here is putting a double attack on the pawn in e4, and we don't care because we're ahead in development, so we're still going to give up the pawn for development. Pawn takes, that's our move now. We're taking d4. Let's always remember the threat of playing d5. So if right now, if we were to play again, we will still play d5. Well, if bishop goes to e7, for example, then we'll still play d5. Right? This is a pattern that has to be understood. And so what does black do after pawn takes? Then we can play knight to d4. Same threat as before. The queen will have to move away, and let's say something like queen c7. Then we can play knight f5. The threat of taking the bishop, well, the black player is not able to castle now, and then taking the pawn with the check, and white is in a very pleasant position. So let's go back. So let's see what happens after knight takes pawn in e4. Then we play knight e5 with attacking the queen. The queen will have to move, but at the same time the queen still has to defend the knight, because the knight, otherwise the rook will take the knight. So after queen to d5, which still protects the knight for the moment, we play queen to h5, and with attacking f7. The only move to stop the white player from going to f7 is g6. So after g6, queen to h4. We have created purposely this weakness on the dark squares of the opponent. Well, yes, the opponent still has the bishop, the dark square bishop, but we've created this weird e6 g6 space, and now we can infiltrate our pieces. So after queen h4, the best move by black is to play d6 to kick the knight away, and we go back to f3. There's no problem with that. We are now threatening to take the knight for free. This is a free knight, so the knight cannot go to f6, right, because we provoked the move g6, and now the knight is not able to go to f6 and be protected because we will just take it. The knight cannot go to g5 neither because there's double attack, bishop and queen. It cannot go to any other square that I'm pointing right now. So the only move to defend the knight now is pawn to f5. And now white continues with development. Knight c3 attacking the queen. So now the threat is the same because the pattern is the same. If the queen goes away, we still have d5 and then knight to d4, and we're completely winning. So let's see what happens after knight takes, which seems the most logical move, removing the pressure a bit. Now we don't even take back. And this is how we exploit this position. So now we're down a knight, but we're going to play queen f6, attacking the rook. So what we're doing now is we are creating as many threats as possible that black has to prioritize so that we can mess up with his position, and then potentially we might recapture this knight. So after queen f6, rook to g8, only move to save the rook. Now white plays bishop g5. Again, we still don't take this knight because we're threatening stuff. We're threatening queen d8. The threat is this: queen d8 check, king goes to f1, and now again we don't take the knight. We just play rook a to c1. The black player cannot, I don't know, play a intermediate move like knight e2 because we will just take it, and we still have a rook on an open file, both rooks on an open files. At the same time, the black knight cannot go to e4 because we will infiltrate with rook to c7 and a deadly attack that's going to lead inevitably to checkmate. So the best move by black now, well, black cannot develop the bishop because it gets taken, and the rook would be taking the knight and infiltrating to c7. It's unstoppable. Oh, and by the way, what happens after knight to b5? Then we can just take the bishop, and we're threatening checkmate in f6. And if the rook takes, then we have a check. It can only be blocked by the bishop and then checkmate. Okay, so here we are. The best move by black now is bishop to d7. This allows the rook to protect the back rank and, well, develops a piece. But still, now we're going to take the knight finally. We've done what we needed to do. We can finally recapture the knight. Now the best move by black is f4, which gives black the opportunity to play queen f5 and finally swap queens and reduce white's initiative. We take the pawn. And after queen to f5, we play queen to g3. So what's going on here? Black can't castle the king. A move like g7 is simply met by queen takes d6. There's nothing wrong with taking this pawn. White has two pawns that protect each other. The bishop is protected by the knight and can move away in case of h6. And white just wins a pawn and prepares to infiltrate the queen to c7, attacking another pawn, and still threaten things like d5 anyway, even from d6. Another plan that would be acceptable is d5, but it also depends on how black plays. And a move like h6 now is simply met by bishop to f4. We have a double attack on this pawn. We're going for that pawn again. And of course, well, g5 cannot be played because we will take the pawn. e5 cannot be played because we will just take the pawn. We have just too much attack on this pawn. And d5 is met by an incredible move, bishop to b8. The idea is to play queen to c7 and take the pawn in b7 and trap the rook. So black's best chance now is to play bishop to c6, protecting the pawn, and white can play rook to e5, attacking the queen. But after the queen moves away, then we can finally play rook a to e1, and this is going to be game over. Bishop can't just go back to d7 to protect his pawn, because then the pawn in e6 is pinned. We would be able to just take in d5, and so the position is falling apart. How about bishop e7 right now? Well, then we just take the bishop in d7. The king can't take back because then we have a fork. Knight e5 wins the queen. And, well, the bishop is protected by the queen. So let's just go back. So actually, let's make a quick recap. Okay, so after the classical Sicilian is on the board, then bishop e5, queen c7, and then we castle. And after a6, we take the knight. Queen takes back. We can play rook e1, and in this video, we're going through e6 variation, d4, pawn takes, and now c3, as we said, is not accepted. Black plays knight f3, and we take the pawn. So in this variation, the knight taking the pawn in e4, we play knight e5, and then there's an attack on the queen. The queen will have to defend the knight because the rook is attacking it. So after queen to d5, queen h5 makes a threat of queen f7. So after g6, queen h4 doubles the attack on the knight. As mentioned here, the best move is d6 to attack the knight, and then we play knight to f3. We don't really want to allow black to take our knight and swap pieces and go into an endgame where he's got a bishop pair. So after knight f3, black's only way to defend is knight in e4, which is being attacked twice, is through f5. So knight to c3 now, and after black takes, we don't take back because we're going to keep threatening stuff. So queen f6 attacking the rook goes to g8, bishop g5 going for the queen d8 threat. So this is not even that far from the opening, and all of these moves are forced. So once they are remembered, it's just going to be easy to be able to play them each time. Now the best move by black is bishop to d7, and we're going to take the knight. Best is pawn to f4, the idea of going to f5. So we take the pawn, and after queen to f5, we play queen to g3, and here we are again. Our goal now is to play knight to d2, knight to e4, and go for these threats, knight f6, knight d6, it depends. So what happens though if black plays bishop to e7, tries to start swapping pieces? Okay, now in this variation, we play d5. Of course, the pawn cannot take the pawn because then we will win the game. And of course, the pawn cannot push because then here there is a tactic. Bishop takes, king takes, and now we can play knight e5. The queen cannot take back because the rook, and if the pawn takes back, we're still going to take with the rook, comes with a check and an attack on the queen. So we're going to be winning material. So what happens after bishop simply takes and tries to reduce the initiative of the white player? Now we take back with the knight, and we're threatening the square e6. So the only move that doesn't make black fall apart, because we're so happy to take the pawn in e6 with the knight, potentially bishop takes, maybe then rook takes, you know, this is going to be amazing position. It's probably going to be a checkmate in some moves. So e5 now kind of stops the whole thing because the knight in e6 will just be taken, and black does have a center, not that great, but it still does have a center. Now we play queen to e3. We could have also played knight to e4, that's also good, threatening knight to d6. Queen e3 is even more accurate though because it targets the b6 square, the c7 square, and the infiltration of the queen and the b7 pawn. So after queen to e3, yes, the goal is still to play knight e4 anyway, and then queen b7 with a double attack on the backwards weak d6 pawn, and that's what we're going to be doing. So if it was our move, now we will play knight e4, and now we're attacking this pawn with the threat of a fork. The queen will have to move, and where can the queen go to protect the pawn in d6? Well, not d6, not f6 because she gets taken. So after queen f8, we're going to play queen to b6, and there's nothing stopping our attack. The position will, the black pair will fall apart after knight d6. So, well, of course we don't get to play again, but that's the plan that we have. That's what we're going for. So now let's say black castles, just an idea, because there were no other moves that really can stop the knight. There are no moves that can stop this kind of threat, knight e4 and so on. So let's see, black tries to castle. Now we play knight e4, and after queen f8, it looks like we can't play queen to b6 because simply black will remove the bishop and the rook will be defending the d6 pawn a little bit more. So our move now from e3 is a7, queen a7, and we're threatening rook a to b1 with an attack on b1 on b7. So let's say black just moves the bishop away to make some space for the rook. It just doesn't help. Rook b1 or something like rook to d7 is met by queen check, and then we can take the pawn. Well, even more accurate, we can take like that because that's checkmate. And of course, well, black cannot really defend that threat neither with the queen because of literally just the same threat. So let's mention one more line. So after the usual opening moves, we castle, and in a6 we take the knight, rook e1 and e6. So we play d4, pawn takes, and c3. The pawn is not accepted. Although if you want to know what happens when the pawn is accepted, that's an even more entertaining video, and that's the first part of this Qc7 Rossolimo video series. So what happens after g6, right? So let's just mention this move. Here, as mentioned before, this is just not good. After g6, we can just take the pawn as we wanted. Right, so now black plays bishop to g7. That's the whole point of playing g6. And white plays knight to c3. So it looks like a completely normal situation, except the fact that white has two pawns in the center, two knights, two minor pieces developed, and rook and queen on two threatening central files, whereas black only has a bishop developed in fianchetto, and the king is in the center though, and the queen is the only other piece developed. So clearly white is much better. Now the goal here, we would play d5 with the usual threats, right? And patterns we've seen before. So after let's just go on a few moves. d5, then queen goes to c7, then we can play e5. After black's best move, now b5, white can play knight e4. This is a typical situation where there's a pawn in e5 protecting these two squares, d6 and f6, and the knight is willing to jump in this, well, probably knight e6 right now. The knight is willing to jump into these amazing places, and in this type of situation, the bishop is not able to take the pawn simply because of pawn takes pawn in e6. And after that happened, the bishop is free to be taken. Now we're threatening bishop pawn takes to f7 with a deadly attack, you know, pawn check, and then the knights are coming, knight to g5. The rook is attacking on open fire, potential queen b3. Right now, well, if black takes with this pawn, we're still going to take the bishop, because after the queen takes, we go knight d6 check, winning the queen. The knight is defended by the queen. If black takes with the other pawn, well, that's the same thing, because then queen takes and knight d6, right? So we're winning the queen. So now we know what we're going for. So that's the pattern we're going for. We're trying to play d5, and when the queen moves, we play e5. And then the knight is coming to e4, exploiting this. The best move by black in this case, instead of bishop takes, right? Because that's something that happens a lot. So that's why I wanted to illustrate it, because a lot of players do take this pawn because they don't really know the pattern. The best move is actually pawn takes in d5, which kind of stops the rook from being able to make any discovered check, because the pawn now is stuck in e5. Now though, we can play knight to d6 check, and after king to f8 we can play queen to d5, and we're in this excellent position because we're threatening checkmate, we're threatening the rook. So even by letting black playing an engine move, the position was completely lost. So let's just go back a few moves. All right, here we are at the initial position of this specific line where the bishop goes to g7. We've just played knight to c3, and we are going for the threat that I've just described. So d5 and so on. The best move by black now is d6. And now white continues with the usual infiltration of the bishop into the dark squares. We don't care about being attacked simply because we're just going to move the bishop, and the kingside area is going to be even weaker. The goal now is to play knight to d5. That's the plan we're going for. Of course, it depends on what black does. We're going to play knight d5. Again, this as it's very obvious, the pawn cannot take the knight. So the knight in d5, and we're playing for the usual threat of rook to c1. This has all been widely explained in the first video. So rook to c1, and then knight c7, and so on. So how does black respond to this? Queen c7 is the best move. Let's say black plays something like queen to b6, just to get out of the way of the rook. You know, the rook will be willing to develop. Also gets away from the c6 squares, meaning that knight d5 could potentially be taken by the pawn, and black doesn't have to worry about discovered attack. So after queen to b6, white plays queen to a4 check, and so now black will have to respond with bishop to d7. Well, it doesn't really have to, but that's the move that develops a piece, comes with an attack on a major piece, and allows the development of the rook. Any other move would be just so much worse. What happens if the queen defends the king and maybe tries to swap queens? Well, that actually gave us a tempo because we managed to develop the queen. Then we're going to play our queen to a3, attacking this weak pawn, and then we're like, the evaluation here is something like +8. Because the queen went back on the c file, and we're going to go to rook to c1, threatening knight d5. And if the queen moves away, we're going to play knight a4, threatening knight b6. The queen doesn't have any access to the dark squares because of the bishop, neither here. So that's huge trouble. Right, so here after the queen a4 check, bishop to d7. Now white plays knight to d5. This is amazing. It seems like we're giving up our queen, but then after knight takes queen, we're threatening the two of them, rook and bishop, and so black will be losing material, will be losing a piece. So after knight to d5, best move by black is queen to d8. Still threatening the queen, but saving the queen, but saving the bishop. At the same time, the bishop could take the queen. So this is actually very deep. It's an engine line. Why will the queen just go from a square where she was being attacked to another square where she's also still being attacked? Well, that's because that's the best thing that can be done. Where can the queen go? Wherever the queen goes, we will be able to play, let's say, for example, where queen a5 will be taken. So queen a7, we can make a check. The king cannot go to d8. The king will have to move away, and we can win the bishop. Queen takes d7, right? So the best move is queen to d8 because it stops all of that. We don't have this knight c7 move. The queen can take it. Now we continue with bishop takes queen. Now black will have to take our queen. There's no other option. and then we play knight c7 check, king takes, and then we take the rook, and we have an escape, and so we're gonna be up in material. We are absolutely better than black. Right, here we are back again. The initial position of this specific line. After knight c3, the best move is d6, bishop g5, and the goal of knight d5, rook to c1, as we just explained. And so what happens if black doesn't play queen b6 to get out of the way, but rather plays queen to c7? This is a possibility. The queen also is not in c6 anymore, therefore knight d5 would be simply taken, and we're not really winning here because then the pawn will not be attacking anything after the discovered check. So after queen to c7, white continues with rook c1, right? Super logical move. And we're threatening to move the knight and have access to c7 and win the game. Now the best move by black is queen to b8, and we play e5. The goal here is to play knight to e4 and exploit this e5 pawn attacking d6 and f6. The knight would love to jump to d6 and have an unbelievable position. So the best move by black now is after white plays e5 is h6, and now knight e4. Well, what happens if, okay, the plan of knight e4 is unstoppable. So for example, if black plays h6, we don't care about the bishop, he will play knight e4. We're threatening knight e6 check, and then rook takes bishop check, and win everything. So let's say pawn takes, knight check. Okay, maybe the rook is not gonna go to c8 with check, but still, I mean, we're still gonna take the bishop with check again. So we recapture the piece, but the blocking is horrible. Back in this position, h6 cannot be played because knight e4 is just too strong. So what happens after white has played e5 instead of h6? White has the goal of, as we said, of going to e4 with the knight. What happens after d4? D5. We don't have access to that square, and we play knight a4. The goal here is to play knight to b6, attacking the rook and also the bishop. So the rook will not be able to move, and we will win the bishop. If the bishop moves, then we are winning the exchange. And we have a dominant position because our rooks will be controlling the open file, and then the queen is coming as well. This is a massive problem for black. So we have a threat of going to b6 with the knight. Best move by black is b5. We don't have access to that square anymore because the queen is protecting it, so we play knight to c5. And we're just enjoying this excellent position. Let's try to go on a few moves and see what black can do to maybe try and castle, or, well, that's not going to be really easy. Let's see what can, and well, there's just going to be just a lot of potential lines, so I'm not going to be able to go through them. But clearly here, what we're going to be doing is just keep control of the dark squares. Let's just say two very quick lines, because all we're mentioning here are the ideas and not the lines. We're not memorizing moves here, we're just understanding the patterns. So after h6, for example, the bishop just goes back, and the goal here is, let's say black plays knight e7 with the idea of playing knight f5 and then castle and maybe play a normal game. Let's try to understand what's going on here. White has got control over the open file with the rook. The knight is better. Black's bishop here will struggle to develop. This rook in a8 is doing nothing, and black king is going to be less safe. So white's position is better. It's something like +4 on the engine evaluation. So that's just so much better. Well, let's just look at the ideas. Knight e7. Now here we play h3. If knight goes to f5, we can kick it out with g4. The knight will have to move back. If the knight doesn't, then we're still going to play a move like knight h2, because there's this f6 square as a weakness that we have provoked and created, and the goal is to play knight to g4, knight to f6, and also put double attack on this pawn in h6, which will create problems to black as soon as he decides to castle, and if he doesn't decide to castle, then that's even worse. So that's the idea of this line. Let's look at just another line very quickly. If black were to play something like knight e7, this is a pattern we've seen before, then we just play bishop to f6, and because we still have queens on the board, and we have that usual threat of, well, right now we're threatening to take the bishop, and if the rook were to go in g8, then bishop taking, bishop, rook taking back, and then the rook will be looking very silly in g7, trapped by its own pawns, and then there'll be the infiltration of the queen soon. So after this move, bishop takes and then pawn takes, we have this control over e7 and g7, two crucial squares for the king, and because the queens are still on the board, we are threatening some really basic but also difficult to stop checkmate. And now after the knight goes back to g8, targeting this pawn, it looks like we're not going to be able to save the pawn, but we're just going to play knight e5. Well, can black castle? Well, no, he cannot, so you're going to have to play knight f6, And if he doesn't play knight f6, we were still going to go queen f3. We are going to go queen f3 right now, but we were going to do it anyway. And now this is a skewer. We're attacking the knight. We're also attacking this pawn in f7, if in case the knight were to move. So this is game over. And just a few moves ago, if the knight doesn't go to g8, but rather just goes to f5, trying to activate itself and allow black to maybe castle, although it looks ridiculous, then white plays queen to d2 and threatens to play g4. This is unstoppable. There's no way to stop g4 from happening. g4 kicks the knight away, and then queen h6 with the infiltration of going to g7, and the rook will have to move, and we'll be capturing pawns. And yeah, these pieces here can only spectate from the distance. If black wants to play h5 to stop g4 from happening, then this simply creates even more weakness over the dark squares. The queen is in g5 now, and it's there to stay forever. This rook will never be able to develop in any possible way. Castling will be absolutely insane. And now what is the plan? The plan now is to play, okay, so we got control of the square e5. We're going to play knight d3, knight to e5. We have a threat of taking in g6 as well, because after pawn takes we take back and it's a disaster. And yeah, all of these moves are possible. Black will not be able to put up any defense in this case because he surrendered the control of the dark squares.